All right, 340 people. I'll get started. So, thank you everyone for coming, and yeah, great to have so many of you here. Great to have such a glittering panel joining me here today. And I think, as we were discussing actually just before, like the pace of change in the world of AI is genuinely staggering, and it is. I know a couple of us on um, chats around prompt engineering, kind of WhatsApp groups, and just seeing the flow of different things that are coming through every day. Trying to keep up with it is quite astonishing, and new things that look like science fiction 6 months ago are just rolling out with such speed. Humans writing AI copy, AI writing human-like copy, the AI writing effective code, AI now acting as an agent, able to interact with services across the internet. It's just incredible. What we are here to talk about today is how all of that change might play out in the world of education in particular. And I think it's worth saying that I don't expect that we're going to get you any answers that are right, but because things are just moving too fast for predictions to be particularly accurate. But the aim is to kind of start exploring this, to get an insight into how people who are working day in, day out at the forefront of this, how we're thinking about it, the kind of way that we see it perhaps unfolding, and the areas of biggest uncertainty and the areas of the biggest opportunity. And hopefully it's a kind of flashlight to help you see a little bit further into that gloom of uncertain mist in the future and have an idea about how it might play out. So to do that, I am both lucky and honored to be joined by this glowing panel around me, who, as I say, are working right at the kind of forefront. So we've got, I'll just do a very quick introduction, but when you start talking, maybe fill in with anything that I've missed. So Josh, who is founder, CEO of Mindstone, building essentially an AI learning coach, previously founder, CPTO at Super Awesome, which was sold into Epic Games, creators of such glorious things as Fortnite. So Josh been building a lot of stuff in AI, in education, right at the forefront for a long time. Raza is founder CEO at Humanloop. So Humanloop actually are the one non-specifically education company among us, but Humanloop have got this incredible, or a kind of layer on top of all LLMs and generative AI systems, working with a huge range of companies across all industries, helping them to interface with and iterate and test on top of all of these LLMs. So it's kind of Humanloop helps us all to do the experimentation that we want to do. Sarah then is founder and CEO of Waggle, which is an AI kind of co-pilot to upskill managers. So again, a way to help managers get better at being managers. So it's a different kind of education. Formerly CEO of Credit Spring, a London fintech. And then finally, Trish, founder and executive chair of SoapBox Labs, which is the world's leading provider of voice AI for children. Also, Ireland's first AI ambassador. She also has 5 patents and was named one of the world's top 50 women in tech by Forbes. So it's a great panel of people to have here alongside me. I'm a co-founder of Memrise. We have a language learning app. We built what we believe to be the world's first AI language partner in the early half of last year, and are now extending that on top of GPT 3.5, GPT 4. Looking at ways to leverage AI all across our product to create a kind of AI language tutor, essentially, is the experience. So moving away from language learning as a course and as a syllabus that's defined, and moving towards an adaptive system that works exactly for the user, the learner at any time. So that's all of us. I wanted one final little note before we dive in, is that we are really focused here today on how AI is going to impact education. I know I've had a lot of questions in the run up to this from people wanting to talk about, is AI going to kill us all? Is it the end? It's an interesting question, but it's not a question that we're going to dive into. My Apple Watch dived in and tried to answer that for me, but we are not going to try and answer that one today. We're going to assume that we're going to muddle through and things are going to be okay. And given that things are okay, how's it going to impact education? So just want to park that one. Any other questions, please do ask, put them in the Q&A. We would love to get to them. So without further ado, let's get into the discussion. So I asked everyone in the run-up to this to think through a few different questions about, just to try and get a sort of picture of the future. So we are thinking about what skills are going to be worth learning in a world where AI can answer so many questions for us and behave in such a human-like way in so many situations. What's that going to mean for assessment? What's that going to mean for exams? What's that going to mean for the corporations and education institutions, universities, and so on? And so those are three things we're looking at. What skills are worth learning? What exams? What will assessment look like? What will education institutions and corporations look like? To start that off, Josh, can I kick over to you with a kind of vision and to start painting a picture for us of what skills are going to be worth learning in this future world that's evolving?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for actually organizing this panel, by the way. I've been giving that question a decent amount of thought. It changes every week at this point because the speed of tech basically changes what the world might look like. But at a high level, I think that the evolution of software engineering in the last 15 years can give us a window to understand what the evolution in other disciplines, in other knowledge-intensive disciplines might look like in the next 2 or 3. And let me just double click on that for a second, right? So 15 years ago, your ability to code was something that differentiated you in the market. Like, it was actually something that other people couldn't do, and there was a skill that produced a lot of value. Today, when you're an engineer, most of your job is using however many millions of different modules that all do very specific things, taking a module on one end, transforming some data, putting it into another, and basically gluing various things together. And what we've seen happen in the last few months already is an enormous amount of verticalized AI solutions that basically perform small tasks in different ways. And so as this evolves and we get more and more of those, the jobs that we all do in a knowledge-intensive industry will likely merge or move towards a system where it's more about understanding how to use those different modules, taking the output of one, putting it into another, figuring out how to improve upon it, and then iterating through that, just like software engineering would be today. Now, and the reason that I talk about that is that I then did a survey of a bunch of CTOs and asking them, what are the skills you look for in a software engineer today? And the ability to code didn't even make top 5. So I found that very interesting, that the top 3 skills for that CTOs would look for today when they're hiring software engineers are the ability to learn, the ability to problem solve, and the ability to collaborate. And so as we move towards a world where we have all of these tools, those are, I think, some of the core skills that will enable you to differentiate yourself, at least from in the workplace.
Can you just list those again? I just wanted.
Yeah, the ability to learn, the ability to problem solve, and the ability to collaborate.
And so that vision that you gave of the AI, just in the coding realm in particular, just to sort of narrow it down to something I can almost get my head around. Yeah. We've got these narrow verticals where we can define what it is you want the bit of code to do, and then the AI can generate some code that does that. And because you've got that type feedback loop, it's quite easy to, or it is very effective at doing that, and you can see that it's done it well. Is it too simplistic of me to try and build a mental model where I think that we've got all these units that we can create, and now we have the ability to, if you can define it clearly, the AI can write it, and you can now generate it. So we're no longer even limited by what has already been written by other people in libraries. We can now just say, here is the problem that I want solved. It goes and gets it. And that then there's this more humanish task of stitching the more unstructured task of how we stitch those together and kind of collaborate between these pieces that may be harder for AI to totally take over from us. Is that a correct extrapolation of what you're saying?
Yes, I'd say so. I mean, there are various different theories on how we might ever one day get to AGI, but one of artificial general intelligence, which is kind of what we're mostly talking about here. But like one of them would be about stitching together 50 million AIs that talk to each other. But right now, where we are today, they can't yet do that. And so the ability to take the output from one part, put it into another, and understanding how that transforms and how you are the middleman to make the result happen that you are trying to get to is something that's still of high value.
And I guess that, oh, sorry, Raza, were you going to say something? What did I miss?
I wasn't, but I can.
Go on then.
Okay, so I guess it's like the person here not from an EdTech background. I kind of see my role as maybe just trying to give the perspective of like a pure technologist. So like I did a PhD in machine learning before this. We build core AI infrastructure, and like a mistake that I think people are making in general is to be amazed by the recent breakthroughs, but then fail to extrapolate forwards or not think about what's going to happen in the future. And so they go, oh, okay, we've got this incredible thing like ChatGPT now. What will society look like in 10 years' time after ChatGPT has dispersed everywhere? And to me, the mistake is to like forget that it's not going to stop here. And so we can sort of try to reason about how good these systems might get, and a little bit of understanding about how we got to where we are now, I think, is maybe helpful in trying to make those predictions, which is that the recent sort of progress has largely come through taking mostly things that we've understood for a long time and scaling them up in terms of compute and data. And we've had a surprising amount of progress doing that, more than I think anyone in the field expected. And if that trend were to continue, we could expect significant performance improvements without many new ideas very fast. And so like the time it might take us to get to milestones where stitching all of those AI systems together becomes something the AIs can do themselves, maybe 1 or 2 years. It might not be 20 years or 30 years. It's like hard to reason with. But I would just challenge everyone to consider the rate of change.
Yeah, and I think that we are, as mere humans, so bad at thinking in that exponential way. It's definitely, it is a challenge, and it feels...
I'll just jump in there as well. So I've come from an AI background as well, and been in this space for 20 years, very like you, Raza. And that's very possible, but it's also possible that we are the future of AGI that everybody talks about when it includes vision and voice and sensor data and all these other things that, it is possible that we're overestimating it too. That once you...
I completely agree. I don't want to say this will definitely happen. I just want to make sure that we consider the possibility, because I think it certainly will keep getting better. Maybe not at that faster rate, but it's not going to be static.
No, 100%. I think I agree with you. Everybody's been shocked. Even people who've been in this field for decades, including myself. But I'm literally sitting on the edge of my seat for the next year to see whether, we go beyond, or does it start to disappoint? And the longer you spend on it, the more we're going to see the limitations and the problems and the biases and the issues that have become, how quickly can we solve the problems that we're going to see as well? And then maybe it's a case of it gets pushed aside or it gets pushed forward, and that will very much depend on everybody's input.
And I guess, Trish, just to bring it back to the point that Josh was making, that picture of this world where it's collaboration, its ability to learn are the things that remain super valuable. What is that going to mean for assessment? What's that going to mean for exams? How do you see that kind of developing in this future AI-empowered world?
Yeah, I think, I've heard everything from people saying we're going to have to go back to pen and paper. They go, really? We really have to can we just go forward instead of back? But you know what? I mean, people would say that if you were to walk into a surgery from 100 years ago, you would walk straight back out again and not do it. But the classroom really hasn't changed that much, and neither has assessment in a very long time. and it's time. This is going to change assessment in so many different ways. But you know, it can go lots of different ways. It can go to the point where we're doing things more like, you know, a PhD viva, a defense, where you stand there and you actually articulate the, you know, and actually has to come from you and your brain, and you bring in biometrics to make sure the person is the right person saying it, and we're assessing in a more dynamic, you know, way, as opposed to this static summative assessments or submission of you know, essays, and you know, the idea that we're going to have to get really imaginative about how we assess, and maybe, you know, the idea of assessment is not right. Like that idea of formative assessment, we've been banging on about this for, you know, probably a decade or two. I actually do think this is the time, and this particularly for higher ed, let's say, and I think assessment when you get for kids is a little bit different. It's just going to, there's been so many blockers in education to change, and so many people being resistant to change. I think this is going to blow it all out. Like, you know, it's going to blow it up, and we're all going to have to just...
It's one of the things at Memrise that we kind of, a founding belief of ours was that certainly in the realm of language learning, exams are almost comically bad. You know, I got my A in French GCSE, I still can't hold a conversation in French. And and kind of everyone knows that. Language exams really do assess nothing but your ability to do a language exam. And they definitely don't judge any of the things that you actually want to do in a language. Make friends with people, make people laugh, all of these things that you don't need to have accurate grammar for, you don't need to have accurate pronunciation for. You need to have a whole load of very different skills in order to do that. And they're things that actually, so this is something we believed at Memrise for a long time, we've been building the product around. And suddenly this has unleashed our ability to do that. So what we did with the Membot was have the situation where you can now for the first time just play out a situation. You're going into a bar and you have to persuade a grumpy barman to try and give you a discount or whatever, give you some free food, and trying to, and you can now have that conversation, play it out. It doesn't matter if you're 100% accurate. It matters that you get your point across. It can understand you, it can respond to you, and it's much more, so it kind of breaks down the need for assessment. That what I need is to be understood. I don't need to get the exam. So
yeah, well, what we've been working with is, you know, using voice AI in education for children learning to read or learn a language right from age 4 or 5. And the idea of making a 5-year-old do an exam is ridiculous anyway. But the idea is that you can actually get them to interact and play and engage and actually practice and learn. And in the background, this is true formative assessment, that when the background you are assessing, we're using voice, speech recognition in the background to analyze the sounds. Did they pronounce them? Did they recall them? And then we don't, you know, we just supply the AI in the background, the voice AI in the background. We don't actually build we use partnerships with, you know, Scholastics and McGraw-Hills and all these people are bringing it to market. And it's the kids. That's the ideal. That, like what you're saying there, is that you're actually truly melting away the assessment into the background. But it's happening because we do need to know whether somebody's progressing or not, because whether you need to take a step back or they need a little bit of intervention. But the idea is that my vision for the future for assessment would be, kids in particular don't know they're being assessed, but they're practicing, they're interacting, they're being playful, it's engaging, it's fun, it's dynamic, but, you know, we're still, you know, progressing along path.
Right, I think that's an important distinction that you're making between the early years and the later. Sorry, I interrupted someone. Was that Josh or Sarah?
I was just gonna say on the adult side, I also think that there's an additional constraint. Like there's this. The half-life of skills is getting smaller and smaller. The time that any particular new skill you learn stays relevant is just dropping through the floor. And with the amount of change, I mean, if the last 4 months are anything to go by, like what I learned last month is absolutely irrelevant today. So, like the speed at which things are changing is so dramatic that the idea of a point-in-time assessment that is somehow supposed to give somebody else an idea of what I am or am not capable of today is just, I don't think it's a tenable position going forward, because it no longer determines what I might be able to do in 3 months. And so the shorter that time frame stays relevant, the more we have to move away from summative assessment and think more about formative and kind of real-time assessment in the first place.
But
Sarah, did you want to?
Yeah, I had this thought in mind when I was hearing you both talking about assessment, and I think, to me, it was like assessments and like diplomas were shortcuts to being able to filter out who would be someone that like, and I think Joshua thought about this stuff a lot. It's a shortcut to be able to filter candidates at work, right? Like at the end of the day, like these assessments from a younger age lead you all the way up to your master's degree or your bachelor degree, which you kind of need to go and find a job. But already we're seeing it, and again, in software engineering is one of the first jobs where this stuff kind of disappeared. It's not saying much about your ability to actually do the job, the diploma that you got back in school. And the more, and this is not necessarily AI related, but we need to think about why do we assess? And I think the key thing is what that assessment leads to is we can use it to potentially help people perform better, whether it is at school or at work. And that's a question we ask ourselves a lot in the space I'm in, which is EdTech, but applied to the workplace, which is performance assessments is important. You need to know where people stand, but it's not because otherwise you rely on feelings and biases a lot. So it needs to be measured, but it doesn't need to be measured just to like have a score on someone and just park them somewhere, but to enable them to reach the next level and to help them where they need to be helped. So I think it's not going to disappear entirely, but the goal for which it's done is going to change a lot.
I just wanted to, there's a question in the chat there from Dory saying, do you think those of us teaching in project-based learning are ahead of the curve in assessments, and students already have to do project learning defense?
Yeah. 21st century skills, project-based, 100%. I wish my kids were doing more of it. Yes.
Yeah. So I guess something that I would add on that is, I think there's the way of assessment based on exams kind of has a twofold narrowing of our imagination. We have a narrowing of imagination of how we assess based on what's possible, and then we create syllabuses that reliably teach to that assessment. And so it's kind of the guardrails are put in on both sides, and we just end up training people to pass that exam because that's the assessment that they've been given at the end. And with this much more flexible situation that we have is much more like project-based learning, where you learn what you need to learn in order to do the project, and you learn what is actually useful kind of on demand for what you're doing. And if you do enough projects, you'll have learned a lot of useful skills. But AI, rather like within development, it allows us to create each of the pieces of code that do any narrow vertical and then stitch those together. I think it can have a similar effect on our ability to create dynamic syllabuses. And that's certainly like the way we've built Memrise is in fact to be not syllabus based, but to be based on individuals' interests, so that everyone gets their own personalized course, which is massively empowered by these changes.
So one of the things that I find interesting is again, if you look back to software engineering or design, actually, so there are different ways to showcase skills, right? Which are through portfolios or accumulation of evidence in different ways. So you've got a GitHub profile or a Stack Overflow profile or a Behance profile. These are things that are already being used to showcase skills that are independent of degrees. And a good Stack Overflow profile today would, when you're an engineering manager hiring for an engineer, would be worth more than a degree from MIT, because there's actual proof that someone has been useful, has been able to go through these problems. And so, actually, one of the things we're working on, one of the things that I think we're going to move towards is to a portfolio style of evaluation across many more industries. And what does a piece of evidence look like in the legal industry versus the accounting versus somewhere else? Like that, you can have a bunch of discussions around that. But I think directionally, that's where I think we might be headed.
There's a university here in Ireland I've started. It's called Immersive Software Engineering, University of Limerick. Kind of like that now. It's a 4-year master's. There's no exams. It's all project based. It's all in the lab, and then internships. And that it's new. It's just started this year, but it's kind of like the Waterloo in Canada kind of style of it, like that. You're moving away from exam. And software engineering is ridiculous. Be sitting in a lecture theatre, like, you know, for hours and hours, you know. And it's the first time I actually seen a course going, that's the future. That's what the future of third level has to be, and particularly in software engineering. Like, you know, you need to be learning by doing. You know.
Raza, you had your hand up.
I was just curious, to what extent do you think that will generalize outside of fields like software engineering or others where there are very like hard measures of performance? It's really easy. Like part of the reason I think software engineering doesn't have as much a culture of credentialism is because it's easier to measure how good someone is. You can give them a task to do and very quickly get feedback on whether or not they're able to do it. But as you suggest, you know, the future is going to be one dominated by softer skills, your ability to learn new things quickly, your ability to collaborate. It's much harder to showcase that in a measurable, demonstrable way than it is to showcase that I can write a piece of code.
So, I mean, this is actually one of the pieces where I think LLMs are creating very interesting opportunities. So you think about how many signals we are leaving behind through everything we do. So everything we read, everything we highlight, everything we comment on, we ask a question about, we answer a question on. Actually, LLMs, if anything, that they're pretty good at trying to figure out what is a good question, what's a bad question, what's a good answer, what's a bad answer. It's not perfect, but like it's getting really, really good at, like, when you start to look at thousands of pieces of evidence that you accumulate, I really can see a future where you end up with some kind of skill profile that just collects evidence as you work, right? So it just observes everything you are doing, the way you're interacting with different things, collects that as you go. So you're getting into some kind of overlap of formative assessment.
But Sarah, is this not like
this
within
exactly
Waggle? This is like
exactly
a lot what you're
we were
doing.
building. Yeah. So actually, when we started working on building Waggle, it started from the premise that management training doesn't work the way it has been built up to now, because it was done in a classroom. You would get taught soft skills before you needed to apply them to your work, and so you forget 90% of that learning within a week, so it never gets applied. But digging into the problem more, we actually found that it's not only that, it's also the fact that we still rely on feelings a lot to assess performance, which is what we were talking about a bit earlier. And in today's world where we do most of our work, especially in like the type of jobs we are in, on computers, we leave 1,000, like not even 1,000, millions of data points every day. And those data points cannot be assessed or used by a human being to assess performance or to be translated into a measure of performance. But with AI, we can do that because we can skim through immense data points and find the signals that say, this person is good at this thing, this person needs help on this thing. And these are the signals that we actually feed managers to help them coach and upskill their teams to be better based on those data points. So basically, this is what I'm trying to build. But yeah, I'm going to stop advertising the
No, that's good. Actually, do you know that a really good point about assessment and what you're saying about all these different data points is assessment really has been designed around the limitations of humans, right? Yeah. You know, we're only able to cope with so much information coming, whether it's on, you know, a really good example being reading. We've always known that prosody, the pace and the intonation of speech is actually a really good indicator of fluency, but humans can't measure that subjectively. But computers can do that very effectively and very objectively. And it becomes a very good measure. So we talk to lots of people in the US now about the future of the next generation of reading assessment. and trying to break, and it's really hard for people to do because, you know, you kind of just go back to what humans, and everybody thinks about AI as replicating what humans can do, where in fact we should be kind of thinking a little bit beyond that, going, like you're saying, all these data points, there's no human could sit there and make sense of that. But if you were to give all these data points and the outcomes to a computer, it can retrospectively mine those data points, find the relevant ones and the connections between, you know, something we cannot do. And ideally be coming out with much better assessment of true potential and where to think. And we see this all the time, but it's very hard to get people to break out of what they've always known, because they always go back to, well, I don't understand that, therefore how could a computer possibly, you know?
It's very interesting. Sorry, go ahead, Darren.
Sorry, Josh, it's difficult on Zoom. I can't help but feel a little bit, I don't know, disappointed or slightly worried about this sort of direction. Like one of the things that, so, you know, when ChatGPT came out and loads of educators were talking about, oh, how will we have exams anymore? Or, you know, we won't be able to assess people. Part of me was like a little bit hopeful and a little bit excited that like this would be a impetus to like remind ourselves that what makes education great isn't just measuring people for like jobs, but actually like the goal is to get people to be able to learn all these new things, and the opportunity here to give people much more personalized learning experiences and break out from molds where they're trying to tick boxes to kind of jump through hoops for an employer was like what I was hoping it would enable. And I'd be really worried or like disappointed if what happened is that now we have a sort of panopticon that follows us around at all times, making us sort of feel consciously, you know, continuously monitored and assessed, such that our economic worth becomes sort of constantly on our minds as we go through everything we do, because any action we take now is being quantified at scale and fed to a future employer. Like that to me is not an optimistic vision, but rather a dystopian one.
So, I'll respond just because. Sorry, Joshua, I'll pass it over to you. I'll respond just because like the application of what we're doing is within the realm of work, right? It's not. I don't think this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to augment human capabilities in a work context. But I think it's super exciting as well that today learning as a whole, even if you don't want to apply it to work, you want to apply it somewhere else and some in a subject that is personal to you, becomes way more accessible and can be customized to your needs. And like what Ben is working on or what Joshua are working on is kind of not necessarily connected to the workspace or the value of learning within work, and enable that highly like customized learning tool.
And I guess, Sarah, to make the positive case as well, because I don't want to just sort of paint a negative picture, I can see that sort of giving a more holistic evaluation of someone will also open up access to people who maybe don't come from, you know, the same educational backgrounds or tick boxes that traditionally we've had to tick. And like, you can have a richer view of what a person is. But at the same time, if we over-index on sort of measuring everything, not everything is measurable. And I just worry that, you know, you become a set of numbers to an AI algorithm, and that starts to become a reduction of what people are rather than something that could expand what we're able to do and give us more capability. So I think there's a balance to be struck.
Josh.
Yeah, so I mean, I just spent 8 years protecting kids from data collection online, right? Building super awesome before. So the whole data debate is definitely one that I take to heart. I think there's a difference between like what is getting collected and what's getting shared. And I think the dystopian bit starts to become important, or starts to come to life when you don't have control over what is getting shared to who and at what point. Like we measure how we sleep, we measure what we eat, we measure so many different things. The ability to measure how you are learning would be the biggest unlock in learning ever. If you could actually visualize your own progress, understand where you are going wrong and where you could do better, that would be the biggest accelerator for learning that we have ever had. You need to go through a quick feedback. You need to collect the data to get to that quick feedback to unlock it. Then there's a whole question about how much of the data do you want to share? I'm a big whiskey fan. If I spend a lot of time learning about whiskey, that's maybe not something that I'll put out on a public profile somewhere because somebody who doesn't know me might not understand this. Everyone should have the ability to moderate that, but I think the ability and what it unlocks in the future that it provides is something that I'm at least very excited by.
I can see that. I guess we've touched on this already, right? There's a distinction between the assessment that's there to help you as a learner, that gives you feedback, that measures progress, and the assessments that are there to tick a box for someone else so you can prove that you can do a job. And they aren't necessarily perfectly aligned.
For sure. And this is something specifically in what we're building. We're building for our users, not for someone to police them. We want to make the managers we help better managers. And we're very, very aware of the fact that, yes, the data that this produces can be super valuable for someone who wants to police their teams, right? But it
needs to be
like at the end of the day, at the end of the day, if you do that, users are not going to use it anymore. So there's like a really fine balance there. And I don't think this is necessarily like AI related. I think this has been true and will remain to be true.
That has been true anyway, yeah. I just want to jump to a couple of questions in the Q&A. So Remorse, do you think that a new skill would be, I write really good prompts? And if so, how might I show my future employer? Raza, what do you think of that?
Well, I was in the offices of Anthropic AI yesterday, who are currently recruiting for a prompt engineer with a salary of $350,000. So there's definitely a demand for this skill currently.
3 months.
I don't know how broad it's going to be and how long it's going to subsist, like stick around. It has a little flavor of, I guess, like if you think as the models get better, then being a good prompt engineer at some point becomes a little bit similar to being good at interacting with someone, understanding, getting an empathy for what they understand and don't, and communicating clearly. And I feel like that's always been a valuable skill. And so like if that's the skill, then yes, because just clear communication is very important.
Right. I feel like we spent a lot of last year and the year before working really hard on our prompt engineering with GPT-2, then GPT-3, and then now most of the work that we put in is like not actually needed. The principles that we learned. The principles that we learned are still applicable, but if I look back to the prompts that I was writing 9 months ago to get an output from GPT-3, and then what do I need to ask GPT-4 to get the same output? I didn't need.
And behind the scenes, we're all working really hard to make that the case, right? We want the models to be as steerable as possible. At the same time, people keep pushing the boundaries. So as we get to like, okay, now it's easier to do what you were doing before with prompt engineering, people start to figure out how far can we push this if we chain things together or if we pull in extra data sources. And so there is always a frontier of people kind of butting up against what the technology is capable of. And if you still consider that prompt engineering, then I think something sticks around, but it changes over time.
And then we had a second one. How will AI add to or take away from or change the way that education institutions try to enact social justice values? For example, reducing the performance gap between students of lower socioeconomic status with those of higher economic status.
Yeah, I can jump in there. This was a huge reason, and one of our kind of mission was to be able to bring AI into the classroom, whereas there was and there continues to be huge equity issues in the classroom, and proven out time again about, especially for children, learning to read is one of the foundational skills. If you don't learn to read by age 8, your chance of future success is severely diminished. And that's across board. This has been proven time again. And the idea is that, if you're in an affluent area, you've got lower teacher to student ratios, you've probably got help at home, maybe you even have a tutor, and over COVID, the actual gap widened vastly. The COVID slide really, really widened. And the idea then is that when you look at the education system, they really aren't going to suddenly solve any of these problems by giving more teachers. It just won't happen. It's just not economically viable. But AI has the potential to help reduce that gap. So if you think about a lot of the research, let's say around reading and language learning, is around practice, right? If you could practice for 20 minutes a day across the board, research says you will rapidly improve. But people not having that, if you think of a teacher to spend 15 minutes a day with each kid in the class takes a full day, but AI can be there and can actually help a child do that oral. It has to be out loud. It's not all, that silent reading, oral practice over and over again, or anything, right? Maths, geography, whatever. If you can do that, you could, and then you go into these poorer areas where actually the teacher-student ratio is much, much higher. So they're being, across the board, the issue is that one-on-one time. And if you can actually start to see how people being able, now that's, I'm talking about young kids, but this can apply it for further education, any stage that you're trying to learn. You are going to level the playing field. You're going to give, ChatGPT right now gives people the opportunity to learn things, and I've been blown away by it, like over and over again, to distill simple concepts. If you think like what we were able to do 20 years ago, I remember thinking when I was writing my PhD thesis, God, how do people write a PhD or do a PhD without the internet? And now I'm thinking about the other day going, damn, imagine writing a PhD thesis now, with everything at your finger. You can still have to vet the information, but you're just leveling it up. Leveling up and leveling the playing field. I think that's super interesting. So the Ivy Leagues, that what the kids that go to those schools or whatever we think about the private education system, all of a sudden you're given access to everybody, and what's that going to do in the future? It's really super interesting to think about that.
Yeah, so I think just riffing on that, well, there's kind of two parts to this question. It's like, how can this technology change social justice? And then a part of it is how do education institutions try to enact that? And I think in terms of the leveling the playing field, it's one of the things we explicitly talk about with the member, is that there's this huge economic issue around the world that learning to speak English unlocks opportunities for you. But for the people who need that most in the countries, lowest income countries in the world, are the people for whom access to a native English speaker, which is basically essential. Like the only way you actually learn to speak a language to get that skill is to be practicing doing it. You have to practice understanding content, and you have to practice producing it. And if you native English speakers tend to be from higher income countries. So if you're from a low income country, you might end up having to pay like a day or a week's wages in order to get a native English speaker for an hour or two. And what you can now do with AI is unlimited practice at extremely low or zero cost. So I think it's definitely, it unlocks that possibility. How education institutions will embrace that or not is kind of another question. And I think the question I was going to ask to you, Sarah, was how will institutions respond to this? Like, what's going to happen to education corporations and universities?
So I think to bring that level up is what do we do? Because we're talking about content here. I think at the end of the day, we're talking about like the ability to access someone who speaks English. And if you think about what universities used to be centuries ago, they were the only place where you could have access to a specific book because there was one copy of that book, and you needed to go to university to be able to read it or to learn how to read it. This is not true anymore, and content is not as rare to have access to as it used to be. And not only universities, but also like other EdTech companies that got built around content, and there's a bunch. How will they evolve now that content was made? Content creation was made way easier and way cheaper with generative AI. What would that look like? How will that affect the value of going to university or like using a platform that creates content? I think these questions are like fascinating to me. I don't think I have the answer, but I think it's a lot is going to change in that space in terms of how do we prove value beyond just the content. And it can be something around how do we curate content? How do we help you filter through all of the noise and all of the content that is out there? Because we're almost in a world where there's too much content. It's not that it's rare.
It becomes about finding the relevant stuff rather than.
Yeah.
I would say we're
which I
way
think
past
again is
almost. Go ahead, Ben.
Yeah, almost. Yeah, but it's kind of back to that point of it used to be make a syllabus and make a really good plausible syllabus that leads you to that endpoint. And now both the endpoint assessment has been blown up and the single path to get there. And it's like, now we've just got all the content, and you've got to try and, what the AI gives the opportunity of is everyone having a sensible path through that. Yeah,
I thought that was, I think that's really interesting when you kind of try and flip it around on like, where do universities make money, right? What's the business model? If the business model is tied to degrees, which they're degree emitting engines, right? At the end of the day, right now, that's if you ask people, why do they go to university? Why do they pay their fees? It is to get the degree at the end of the funnel. As you have the value of degrees that is declining, the entire business model of universities is about to just be pulled out from under them. Some of them might be able to adapt, but I would argue there's a whole question of how it is the model that we think about university today relevant at all in the next few years.
Right.
Josh, what do you think? Sorry, Ben. Please go ahead.
No, you go, Raza.
I was just going to say, I guess it depends what we as a society think universities are for. And we've had them for a very long time. They're like very important research institutions, right? They're the places where our academics do stuff. And they're also the places where our adolescents go to transition often from sort of being, towards adulthood. And those are still important roles that I think like they play, that if we value, we should figure out how to keep them around. And maybe they become less good as credentialing institutions. But again, I'm optimistic. Like, I think that's a positive thing.
But I think that the difficult thing is that in a way, all of those other really important functions of universities have been supported and paid for by the credentialing.
Only recently, not for the 800 years before that.
True. Well, what was it for the 800 years before that then?
To me, it was really access. Yeah, access to knowledge. Like, people didn't know stuff if they didn't go somewhere where someone would teach them, because that was the only place people would teach you stuff.
Yeah. But that's no longer the case either, because
both of those rugs have been pulled out.
Yeah.
It was other institutions. It was religion and things like that, right? A lot of early universities were sort of church funded or state funded for other reasons. But my point is that they have societal value beyond their credentialing. We could choose to pay for them.
Right, and I guess, but I guess my point is that yes, they have this other value, but what has been paying for them may no longer have the value. That may no longer support them. So how do we find another way to support the valuable parts?
In the UK were $3,000 a year, or £3,000 a year, then 9,000 now. When my parents went, they were free. So like, it's not necessarily the case that the credentialing is what's paid for them. Like, the idea of like fee-supported universities in the US, all universities are basically, like the large ones, are largely supported by their endowments. You're not really reliant on the fees, right? Like Harvard or others have enormous endowments that pay for them. So there are other models, like we could figure it out.
I just got it. There's another couple of questions in here. So one, Memrise and Duolingo have added those ChatGPT-based conversation assistants to their products recently. I'm wondering if and how much this new technology will force these companies to transform their core products to stay relevant. Second question, with ChatGPT being free, what is there to prevent learners going straight to the source rather than bother signing up on or paying EdTech tools? They rely on ChatGPT to bring value to their users. I guess I'll take this one. So great question. So in two parts. I think the way we've built Memrise, as I've said a couple of times, is to be not syllabus based, but to be individual need based, and that I think dovetails extremely well with what with the member and what we built there with the chat assistant. The idea is you have conversation, you can learn some words, you then actually wind back. The structure of Memrise is three pillars: learn, immerse, and communicate. Learn is where you learn a bunch of words. Immerse is where we filter content from anywhere on the internet to find video content that uses the words that you've just learned, or that you've learned in total, so that we can always find video content that is just above your current level. So it is to this point of filtering all of the content in the world rather than trying to make our own syllabus. It's find videos anywhere on YouTube, TikTok, find the ones that work for you. And then communicate is where you get to practice with an AI bot using the language that you've learned. And that structure is sort of self-reinforcing, because then you can go and have conversations, come across new vocabulary that then gets added to your list of vocab that you're learning, which then means you can make sure that you remember it, memorize it, so that next time you come to a conversation, you're more likely to remember it. So that structure, we in fact have been building prior to the advent of these generative AI technologies at the level they are today. But there's no doubt it makes it much better to have that. So it definitely works very well with it. From the outside, looking at Duolingo, it feels to me like they've stuck it on the side, and that they have built their whole product around a syllabus-based learning and this skills tree that is at the core of it. And I don't have any good ideas on how they would actually integrate those. It does feel like a bolt-on to me, but I've spent 10 years building something in not that structure, so it's perhaps not surprising that I think the structure that we've built it in is more flexible to this advent. Second question, with ChatGPT being free, well, or nearly free, what's there to prevent learners? So again, I looking at Duolingo's model out of the side, well, they're using GPT-4, which is not free, but I totally agree. The implementation that they've done of it, I can't see how it raises above GPT-4 plain out of the box. And honestly, I think charging 20 quid a month for it is quite an extraordinary decision. And I can't see it being sustainable. What we do in the Membot is setting up situations where we pre-prime the AI with the situation that you're in. So you're in a post office and you have to do something. There are a couple of tricky aspects to that you don't get out of the box. One is making there be a bit of tension in the conversation. If you're having a conversation with the AI and you just have to order a beer and you say, "I'd like a beer, please," and the AI says, "Here's your beer," that is not a great learning experience. It's not very fun. You don't do it twice. You're just like, well, that was a bit rubbish. What makes it fun is working out how to create tension so that you say, "Yeah, I'd like a beer, please," and the AI says, "No, sorry, I don't think you're 18." And you're like, "Oh, no, look, I am. Here's my ID. That ID looks faked." And making it so that you have to try and persuade the AI and have a bit of a push in the conversation. Setting that up requires some prompt engineering, requires some subtlety. And then making it more of a mission so that you have to achieve something and we get the AI to recognize when you've achieved it. That also requires some subtlety to be able to say, has this goal been met? So those are things that you don't get out of the box. I honestly don't think it's £20 a month value, but I think it's definitely a huge value add over over free, and I think we'll stop people doing that. So there's my. Thank you for that question. Allow me to just sell my product. Apologies everybody else for that.
No, I enjoyed that thoroughly, Ben. And I just add, as someone who's a bit of an autodidact a lot, it's a bit like asking, why would you go to a tutor or a class when you have access to the internet and a massive library? And it's true that you can learn a lot of things from those tools, and I teach myself a lot. But figuring out where to start or what order to do things in, or where you're weak and strong and what to focus on is really hard without extra structure or feedback that I think things like both Duolingo and Memrise really help with.
Thank you. There's a BBC-like balance there that you've put there, Raza. We've got a couple more. So anonymous attendee, do you have any thoughts on using AI in gamifying education to increase involvement and interest in students? Any insights into using this type of technology to increase student retention in learning?
So this is one that we have thought about a lot. Depends on like your definition of how wide you put your definition of gamification. Right? But one of the biggest things for us is the quick feedback loop. Is you do something, you get something, and so to that regard, it can absolutely be used, because showing someone that they are making progress towards a goal that they value is one of the biggest motivators that you can find. And so if you can somehow visualize or make it concrete that the person understands, like, I did X and I got a result for it, which is one of the biggest problems with education, is that you have to put in an enormous amount of time and then hope that by the end of that, you might get a result. And if you can shorten that dramatically, then yes, I think there's a lot of scope to basically bring motivation up within an education environment, within a learning environment.
I'm conscious of time. We've got 4 minutes here. I might just try and rush through. We're probably not going to get through all of these questions, but actually, is there anything from the panel that any of you feel that you want to add in, or some ideas that have come out before I try and get to as many of those questions as we can? Well, then I'll try and get to as many questions as we can. So first one, actually, I think we've kind of answered this one. What do you think the impact of education-purposed AGI models for global education issues? There's currently an education AI model in Africa helping children to get access to the same level of education as someone in NYC. What do you guys think? I mean, I think we've kind of spoken to that quite a bit already, so I'm going to pass that. I mean, I think it's an exciting prospect. Okay, Dory, I'm going to pass you just for now because we've had a couple of questions. I'll get back to you if you've got time at the end. So, Hannah, less of a question, more of agreeing on the content question. There are no more knowledge gatekeepers, and now it's about managing content and making sense of it and how you're going to use it for your individual personal growth. Education needs to be turned around and focus on the progress and success of the learner and not the education institution. Yeah, I think great point. God, these questions keep coming. Shugo C, what are your thoughts on using GPT to design educational games or gamification to teach essential skills? Do you feel like we've answered that one, or is there more that people want to say on that?
I think engagement is key, and if gamification, I mean, you know, there's also people have this negative aspect of gamification when it comes to kids, because kids on screens, blah, blah, blah. But I think there's a very fine balance between boring the pants off them, sitting in a class where you got the faster and we're always playing to the middle, like you bore kids or you leave them behind. Gamification, if it comes with personalization, dynamic learning, means better education and everybody moves forward. And that personalized learning.
This is in the adult space. There's something really interesting, which is that as learning is now, well, is already and is becoming much more and more important, there's actually a negative association that lots of people have with the word learning to start with. They instantly think about classroom. They think it's a hard thing to do. Learning can be completely amazing when you actually find a way to learn well. Like the idea of understanding something new to getting a new skill, those are things that people can really enjoy if it is presented in the right way. And so our entire engagement with learning is probably going to have to go through a change, because if you're not finding a way to enjoy learning, the future is not going to be very fun, because you're going to have to do a lot of it.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think we're going to move towards a society where people take control over what they want to learn, and you can make up your own curriculum if we want to keep the language of like schools and universities. So yeah, figuring out what works best for you in terms of learning is going to be key, especially as we're seeing stuff is moving so fast. You need to keep up with the pace, otherwise, unfortunately, a lot of people are going to get left out.
I just got probably time for one more. It's at 6 o'clock, but just a final one because it's amusing. From Wojciech, in a looming era of simultaneous language translation, will there be much value to foreign language learning? So I think super interesting one, actually, because I think it gets to the heart of the difference here. It's kind of, the way I think about this is I can like get let me think. I could have an avatar in virtual reality go dance for me, but it doesn't mean that it stops me wanting to dance. You can have a machine do something for you, to play tennis for me more effectively than I can. It doesn't stop the value of me enjoying playing tennis. And I think the same is with certain aspects of language learning. Like for transactional learning, if I'm just on a weekend trip to Turkey and I need to get something done, will I use Google Translate to make that happen for me, or whatever the AI is? Yeah, for sure. But that doesn't, I think, take away this fundamental need for humans to connect, and language being the way that we connect with each other and transfer meaning between each other, and that it's fundamentally and qualitatively different to speak another language than it is to speak through a translation agent. And I think it is more like that performance skill than just a translation. But that's perhaps my optimistic hope.
I would add another part of that as well, which is it's one thing about just passing a message from one to another, but understanding a different language is also understanding a different reasoning paradigm, a different point of view from whatever problem you're reasoning in. There are specific problems that I can express in one language, but I can't in another. And there's a reason for that, is different cultures have different ways of approaching these, and they have emerged over time. And so it's also much more than pure communication.
I think that is all we've got time for now, but thank you all for your questions, and thanks to all the panel. Awesome. It's been fun.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all very much. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.